Did you know? When Nintendo was at their peak pursuit of high-end graphics and making N64, they were also making a 32-bit Game Boy successor? It would have been the most powerful handheld on the market. And it was gigantic, about 7.5 inches tall, with a color screen twice the size of Game Boys. It should have come out, and the fact it didn't puts us in a weird timeline. The alternate reality where it launched in '97 is actually the normal timeline, because the reason it disappeared is primarily due to one unprecedented, unforeseeable fluke: Pokemon. Pokemon gave Game Boy a second life. No game had ever done that before, and never again in 30 years since. It turned the timeline completely upside down, and we're still feeling the effects to this day. This is the full story of Project Atlantis. In the late 80s, Nintendo R&D 1 was led by Gunpei Yokoi, with Satoru Okada as his lieutenant. When they made Game Boy, Yokoi wanted to make it more like Game & Watch, but Okada envisioned it more substantial, like a portable Famicom, and Okada ultimately won out. Okada also wanted color, while Yokoi insisted on monochrome to keep costs down and make batteries last longer. This time, Yokoi got what he wanted. Japanese press thought he was crazy since color was already standard. Internally, even Nintendo thought Game Boy was cheap trash destined for failure. But they were all proven wrong, as David ended up slaying every color Goliath, from Lynx to Game Gear. "We fought like hell," said Okada, "but together, we made hits." Despite their victory, Yokoi and Okada's creative differences ultimately drove them apart, and the department split in two. Yokoi wanted to pursue creative new ideas and started making Virtual Boy to reinvent portable gaming. Meanwhile, Okada still couldn't resist the temptations of color. His team made prototypes, but ran into all the same problems. Too big, too expensive, and not enough battery. President Yamauchi saw what they were up to and scolded them. "You guys should just go to sleep," he said. "You're wasting money working this much. Don't be thinking up things we don't need." But the situation changed in 1994 as Game Boy approached the end of its life. Sales were slowing, and it was time for the next generation. So Okada's team commenced Project Atlantis. A fitting name, as it would eventually become a legend lost to time. But actually, they chose the name because they expected to launch around the Atlanta Olympics in 1996. To be clear, every Nintendo system has a code name. If Atlantis came out, it would have been called something else, like Game Boy Turbo. Not only would it add color, it was also upgrading from 8 bits to 32. The screen was twice the size of Game Boy's, 3 inches wide, 2 inches tall. It was the same widescreen ratio Game Boy Advance would eventually be, but Atlantis' screen was 50% bigger. The system itself was bigger too, around 7.5 inches tall, dwarfing even the largest Game Boys. In modern terms, it's about 2 Switch lights stacked on top of each other. Probably the best comparison is a handheld you might have never heard of, the PC Engine GT, which was roughly the same size and with widescreen color. Released a year after Game Boy, it was one of the competitors that gobbled up batteries and cost too much. Game Boy was akin to NES, both in terms of its 8-bit graphics and its button layout. Atlantis was more like Super NES, so it needed 2 more face buttons. Nintendo only released one photo, which unfortunately doesn't show every angle. Okada said they experimented with L and R buttons on the back, since having them on top was too far to reach. This 3D model we made reflects his description, though of course there's some interpretation on our part. Atlantis was also said to have a link cable port and another for controller input, so we've included those as well. Atlantis leaks started bubbling up in early '96. Then at E3, the floodgates broke wide open. Nintendo didn't formally announce it, but gaming magazines got the specs from Advanced Risk Machines, the semiconductor company supporting Atlantis. Their low-power 32-bit processors allowed for SNES-level graphics with up to 30 hours of battery. As far as games, EGM reported Nintendo making Mario's Castle as a launch title, and NextGen magazine said select studios already received dev kits to start making games of their own. After those publications hit newsstands, Nintendo reps confirmed that Atlantis was real, but not to expect it until next year. It was a thrilling time to be a Nintendo fan, right on the cusp of the next generation. In a few months, they'd be playing N64, the most powerful console in history, soon to be followed by Atlantis, the most powerful handheld. Absolutely massive leaps from what came before. At home, the living room would be going from this to this, and the palm of your hands from this to this. The future looked bright, and everyone was excited. But then, one unforeseeable fluke turned the tides of history and sunk Atlantis to the bottom of the ocean. By now, Game Boy was 7 years old and ready for replacement. Nintendo hadn't made a game in over a year. The first couple of months of '96 didn't see a single release from anyone. It was essentially a dead system. But then, some indie devs working out of an apartment launched an RPG called Pokemon. Not even its creators had high hopes. It was riddled with bugs, and Famitsu reviewed it 7 out of 10. For any other title, that would have been the end of it. Games usually fall off the sales charts after the first few weeks, but Pokemon did the opposite. It climbed the charts. Kids were evangelizing at the playground, till eventually it was outselling Mario 64 and kept on chugging. Eventually it grew into the biggest game of all time and got people buying Game Boys again too, which encouraged third parties to make even more games. All this led to the unprecedented phenomenon of Game Boy actually having 2 life cycles, with the second even bigger than the first. Just look at this chart. It's a complete aberration that never happened before and never would again. They were developing a new handheld with really fancy graphics, remembers Nintendo artist Benimaru Ito. It was around N64's launch, when the vibe was like, from now on, it's all about machines with high-end graphics. But then Pokemon sold like crazy, link cables flew off the shelves, Game Boy Pockets sold like hotcakes, and the whole tide shifted. So Nintendo decided to ride the wave and put Atlantis on ice, which is bizarre to think about in modern terms. Imagine 2024 when Switch was 7 years old and everyone knew its successor was right around the corner. The specs leaked and word was getting out about its games. Then out of nowhere, an indie RPG comes out and so many Japanese people buy it that Nintendo decides not to release Switch 2. It's hard to imagine such a bizarre scenario, but that's what happened to Atlantis. The key difference between then and now is that Switch 2 can play Switch 1 games. However, Atlantis could not play Game Boy games. Nintendo didn't think backwards compatibility was necessary and couldn't have predicted Pokemania. In 1997, all their handheld competitors were dead, meaning if Atlantis did release, Nintendo would only be competing with themselves and cannibalizing their own market. We talked to our connections at NOA, who told us Virtual Boy was a contributing factor as well. It flopping at launch and dying in '96 spooked the handheld market and shook Nintendo's confidence in releasing a new system. So they didn't cancel Atlantis, but they did shelve it. Internally, many thought Pokemon was a fad that would burn out in a year or two, and when that happened, they could pull Atlantis back off the shelf. Speaking of Virtual Boy, '96 was also the year Yokoi resigned from Nintendo. He said it wasn't the company it used to be and didn't believe in its recent obsessions with horsepower. Making good games is about coming up with good ideas, he said. But developers have been using an escape route for their lack of ideas, better graphics, and more colors. After Virtual Boy's failure, he quickly threw together the smaller, less expensive Game Boy Pocket as a surefire success, so he could go out on a high note. Then he started his own company, and his most loyal staff went with him. Okada was not a loyalist. In fact, he didn't even like Yokoi anymore. He was glad Yokoi left, and with him gone, Okada became the new head of Nintendo's handheld division. His first act in charge was making Game Boy Light as sort of a side project. It was intended as the final 8-bit handheld, a stopgap till the next generation. Nintendo wasn't even making Game Boy games anymore. Other than Game Boy Camera, they hadn't made a game in 4 years. They'd completely moved on. But then history took another turn, because they found out Yokoi's team was making a handheld of their own, the Wonder Swan. It would have triple Game Boy's battery life and sell for a lower price. It was graphically superior too, with 16 bits and 16 shades of gray. And it had a clever system flipping concept that let you play it horizontally or vertically. It was better than Game Boy in every way. That was its purpose, to be the Game Boy killer. Even if Nintendo brought out the big guns with Atlantis, they'd be painting themselves into a corner. It'd be Game Boy versus Game Gear all over again, except this time, Nintendo would be Game Gear. The expensive giant versus the smaller, cheaper wonder. President Yamauchi called an emergency meeting and demanded a color Game Boy. It had to be backward compatible with Pokemon and every other last-gen cartridge. He wanted it to sell cheap and launch before WonderSwan, which gave him less than a year. And with that, Atlantis was forgotten. Many within Nintendo weren't happy about it, including Okada. We had begun working on the 32-bit Atlantis project a long time before, he said. It felt like we'd done all we could with Game Boy's 8-bit processor, and that it was high time we moved on to better things. And that's what Atlantis was supposed to do for us. It was going to give us that boost. The game designers were unhappy with this too and said, "We've already completely exhausted the possibilities with Game Boy, and the only upgrade you bring us is color? What were you thinking?" And frankly, they were right. The entire Game Boy Color generation, Nintendo only developed 4 new games. Wario Land 3 and Kirby Tilt and Tumble were 2 of them. Another was Bionic Commando, which was actually made by an American team. And the 4th was a Magic the Gathering inspired card game that only released in Japan. Other than that, they just re-released old Game Boy games with added color and ported a couple NES titles. They just run out of ideas and enthusiasm. Granted, Capcom made a couple Zeldas and Camelot made some Mario Sports, but when it comes to games Nintendo made themselves, 95 to 2000 was practically a lost generation. And don't get us wrong, we bought some of those re-releases and enjoyed them, but a generational leap with new ideas would have been better. We already covered the ensuing war in our recent WonderSwan video, and we don't want to retread more ground than we have to. So to sum it up in a single sentence, Yokoi died in a car accident before the war began. His loyalists picked up the banner and kept fighting, but Game Boy Color crushed him in the end, mostly thanks to Pokemon. As soon as Okada's team finished making GBC, they rebooted Project Atlantis as the Advanced Game Boy Project. Thanks to a few years' technological progress, GBA managed to solve a lot of their old problems. It was smaller, cheaper, and more battery efficient. It had a similar ARM processor as Atlantis, but now that Nintendo understood the importance of backward compatibility, they made sure to include it from the very beginning. Aesthetically, GBA's curvier form factor was thanks to them bringing in French designer Gwenaël Nicolas, who wasn't involved with Atlantis. There were some trade-offs though, like GBA having a smaller screen and only 2 face buttons. But before you go thinking Atlantis was better, now's the point in the video we need to come down to reality a bit. Because Atlantis wasn't quite as awesome as 90s magazines hyped it up to be. There are a few details we don't know and aren't on the record. But with the benefit of hindsight and some technical math, we can try and fill in the gaps. Magazines reported a 30-hour battery life. However, that only would have been possible if Atlantis wasn't backlit. But high-quality TFT screens, like the one on Game Boy Color, didn't exist yet. At the time, color screens essentially required backlights. Game Gear, Lynx, PC Engine GT, Nomad, they were all backlit because they had to be. So it's our belief that, yes, Atlantis would have had a backlight. But backlights suck up a lot of battery. 30 hours was possible without a backlight, but since it did have one, Atlantis really only could have got around 6 hours. And that's assuming it housed 6 AA's, like every other color handheld. Which means if you played a couple hours a day, that'd cost you almost $50 a month in power. The biggest unknown is Atlantis' price. Game Boy Color launched for $80, but Atlantis probably would have been closer to $150. So when you account for its screen quality, price, and battery life, Atlantis basically would have been a Nintendo Game Gear. And that's why WonderSwan was such a formidable threat. It retailed for $40 and got 30 hours off a single battery, amounting to a super Game Boy Pocket. All that to say, we really did end up with a better handheld in Game Boy Advance. On the other hand, a portable Super Nintendo would have been more impressive a few years earlier. 32 bits in the palm of your hand during the GameCube era just didn't hit the same as it would have the generation before. And maybe that's what should have happened and would have happened if not for the freak success of Pokemon. In our weird timeline, Game Boy lived for 12 years, then GBA only got 3. In the normal timeline, they would have gone about 7 years each. Their life cycles would have been balanced and we would have gotten more 32-bit games and probably a few alternate models as well. you know, like an Atlantis Pocket, and maybe a horizontal model akin to our timeline's Game Boy Advance. But since the generation only lasted 3 years, we just got one alternate model, the clamshell backlit SP. Some of y'all might be wondering, hey, why did GBA only last 3 years? The reason its life was cut short is because Sony announced the PlayStation Portable in 2003, and Nintendo knew if GBA was next to it on store shelves, they'd get slaughtered. At the time, Okada was actually working on another Game Boy successor called Project Iris. But fearing the PSP, Yamauchi told him to scrap it and rush out Nintendo DS instead. Similar to how Atlantis was canceled to rush out Game Boy Color. I guess you could say history repeated itself. Nintendo's new president, Satoru Iwata, didn't think it was the right call and preferred Iris, but that's another story we'll cover next time. Until then, did you know some of the Game Boy devs who followed Yokoi to make WonderSwan also worked on PSP? For the full story on WonderSwan, click the video on screen. And if you want to hear me talking about Pro Consoles for 44 minutes, this is not the video for you, it's only 43. Special thanks to our translator Jacob, Doom for proofreading, and especially Florent Gorges, who interviewed Okada after his retirement and wrote the best Nintendo history books ever published. We highly recommend them. And of course, thank you for watching. See you next time.